What if the richest empire in human history didn't just control land, but controlled the very flow of wealth across the entire known world? Imagine a civilization so powerful that gold, spices, silk, and knowledge moved through its veins like blood through a living organism. For centuries, historians believed wealth was scattered, fragmented between distant kingdoms. But recent discoveries suggest something far more astonishing. A single empire may have orchestrated it all, silently shaping economies, cultures, and destinies across continents. This was not just power. This was control on a scale that feels almost impossible even today. How did one empire accumulate unimaginable wealth? Where did it come from? And more disturbingly, how did it disappear, leaving behind only fragments of a system that once dominated the world? To understand this empire is to confront a truth about humanity we may not be ready to accept. Everything we thought we knew about wealth in the ancient world was wrong. For decades, history textbooks painted a familiar picture: isolated empires rising and falling, each accumulating riches within their own borders. Rome had its gold. Persia had its trade routes. China had its silk. But what if all of them were only pieces of something much larger? A hidden network. A system so vast that no single civilization truly stood alone. And at the center of it, one empire quietly pulling the strings. It begins not with gold, but with movement. Across deserts, caravans stretch like serpents over endless sands. Ships carved through oceans, carrying cargo more valuable than entire kingdoms. Spices worth their weight in gold. Silk so rare it was treated like treasure. Ivory, gems, rare metals, flowing across continents in a constant, unstoppable stream. But this wasn't random trade. It was organized, controlled, directed. And increasingly, historians are realizing, it all pointed back to a single dominant force. Archaeologists have uncovered something deeply unsettling. Artifacts from distant regions, Africa, Asia, Europe, sharing identical markings. Coins minted thousands of miles apart bearing strikingly similar symbols. Infrastructure so advanced it connected regions that should never have been connected at all. Roads that defied geography. Ports positioned with unnatural precision. It was as if someone had mapped the entire world and optimized it for one purpose: wealth extraction. At first, researchers dismissed it as coincidence. Independent innovation. Parallel development. But the patterns became impossible to ignore. Trade routes weren't just overlapping, they were synchronized. Economic systems weren't just similar, they were interdependent. And at the center of this web, one empire stood apart. Not necessarily the largest in land, but the most connected. The most influential. The one through which the greatest volume of wealth passed. But here's where the mystery deepens. This empire didn't flaunt its dominance the way others did. There were no grand declarations of world conquest. No monuments screaming superiority. Instead, its power was invisible. Embedded in systems. Hidden in logistics. It didn't need to conquer every land, because it controlled what those lands needed to survive. Trade became its weapon. Dependency became its strategy. And then, something even more disturbing emerges. Ancient records, fragmented, incomplete, suggest that this empire understood something others did not. That true wealth wasn't gold or land, but control over movement. Control over exchange. Control over connection itself. By controlling the flow, they controlled everything. But if such an empire truly existed, why don't we know its name with certainty today? Why does it feel like a shadow in history rather than a clearly defined power? And most unsettling of all, if they once controlled the entire flow of wealth across the ancient world, what exactly caused their disappearance? Because empires don't just vanish without a trace. Unless something far bigger was at play. To understand how such an empire could exist without leaving behind the kind of obvious dominance we expect, we have to rethink what power actually looked like in the ancient world. This was not an empire built on conquest alone. It was built on something far more sophisticated: control over the arteries of civilization itself. The ancient trade networks we now call the Silk Road were not just roads. They were systems. Living, shifting networks that connected continents like a circulatory system, and at the heart of that system, one empire learned how to control the flow. Unlike Rome, which expanded through military force, or Egypt, which relied on geographic advantage, this empire operated through influence and coordination. It didn't need to conquer distant lands when it could make those lands dependent on its infrastructure. Key trade cities were positioned like strategic nodes, each one acting as both a gateway and a checkpoint. Goods didn't just pass through, they were taxed, regulated, redirected. Every caravan, every ship, every merchant unknowingly participated in a system that fed immense wealth back to a central authority. The scale of this operation is almost unimaginable. At its peak, this network connected over 6,000 kilometers of land routes and countless maritime paths. To put that into perspective, it would be like controlling the entire global shipping system today, not just owning ports, but determining which goods move, where they go, and at what cost. Silk from China, spices from India, gold from Africa, glass from Rome, all of it passed through controlled channels. And with each transaction, wealth accumulated, not in bursts, but in a constant, unstoppable stream. But the true genius of this empire was not just in building the network. It was in stabilizing it. Trade requires trust. And this empire created a system where merchants could travel vast distances with a level of security that was unprecedented. Roads were protected. Agreements were enforced. Currency systems became more standardized. For the first time in history, regions separated by thousands of miles could operate as part of a single economic ecosystem. This wasn't just trade, it was the early blueprint of globalization. Then came the twist. As researchers dug deeper into ancient records, a pattern emerged that challenged everything. This empire wasn't just facilitating trade, it was shaping it. Certain goods became more valuable not because of scarcity, but because of controlled scarcity. Supply was manipulated. Demand was engineered. Entire economies were influenced without those within them even realizing it. It was not just a network. It was a system of quiet control, where influence replaced domination. And yet, despite this extraordinary level of sophistication, something began to fracture. Trade routes shifted. Key cities declined. The once stable flow of goods became unpredictable. Climate changes, invasions, internal instability, all have been suggested as causes. But none fully explain the sudden unraveling of such a finely tuned system. It's as if the mechanism itself, so dependent on perfect balance, collapsed under its own complexity. What remains today are fragments. Ruins of once thriving trade hubs. Coins that hint at forgotten connections. And a haunting realization: this empire may have come closer than any other to controlling the entire flow of global wealth. But if such control was possible once, what does that mean for the systems we depend on today? If an empire once controlled the flow of wealth across the entire known world, then the most unsettling question is not how it rose, but how close we are to repeating it. Because what that ancient system discovered was not bound to its time. It revealed something deeper. A principle. That true power does not lie in owning everything, but in controlling how everything moves. And today, that idea has returned, on a scale far beyond anything the ancient world could have imagined. Look closely at our modern world. Vast cargo ships crossing oceans. Invisible financial systems moving trillions of dollars in seconds. Supply chains so complex that a single disruption in one region can ripple across the entire planet. We like to believe we live in a decentralized global economy. But beneath that illusion lies a structure strikingly familiar. Key choke points. Strategic hubs. Critical dependencies. The same patterns that once defined the richest empire in history, now define our world. And here's where it becomes deeply unsettling. That ancient empire collapsed when its system became too complex to sustain. Too interconnected. Too dependent on stability. When even one part failed, the consequences spread like a chain reaction. Trade slowed. Wealth stopped flowing. Entire regions that once thrived became isolated almost overnight. It wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was something far more dangerous, a silent unraveling. A system that simply stopped working. Now imagine that happening today. Not in a world of caravans and sailing ships, but in a world of digital finance, global logistics, and billions of people relying on constant movement. Food, energy, medicine, technology, everything depends on flow. And just like in the ancient system, that flow is more fragile than it appears. A disruption in one part of the network can cascade outward, faster and more devastating than ever before. But the implications go even deeper than economics. That ancient empire understood something about human nature that we are only beginning to grasp again. That control over systems shapes behavior. It influences decisions. It creates dependencies that are invisible until they are broken. Entire civilizations believed they were independent, while unknowingly relying on a structure they did not control. And when that structure disappeared, so did their stability. What makes this realization so powerful, so almost disturbing, is that history may not be a series of disconnected empires rising and falling. It may be cycles of systems. Systems that grow more complex, more efficient, more interconnected, until they reach a point where their own scale becomes their greatest weakness. The richest empire in human history may not have fallen because it was weak, but because it became too powerful to remain stable. And so we are left with a question that lingers far beyond the past. Are we building something similar right now? A system so vast, so efficient, so interconnected, that it feels unbreakable? Because if history has shown us anything, it is this: the more invisible the system, the more dangerous its collapse. Civilizations rise on what they can see: land, armies, monuments. But they fall because of what they cannot see: connections, dependencies, fragile flows of power moving beneath the surface. And perhaps the greatest illusion of all is believing we are in control of the systems we depend on. Because once, long ago, there was an empire that believed the same thing. And it vanished.